Let's get started. Story number 1.
We decided to go camping that weekend to get away from the city. It was supposed to be just a short trip, a quick escape into nature before the real winter set in. My friends Mark, Chris, and I were always looking for new ways to get out of the house, and winter camping seemed like the perfect challenge. We chose a remote spot in the Adirondacks, a place we'd heard about from an old hiking guide, far enough away from the usual crowds. The weather forecast called for light snow, but we figured it wouldn't be a problem. We had all the gear, warm sleeping bags, a sturdy tent, a small stove, and we were used to roughing it in the wild. By the time we reached the trailhead, the snow had already begun to fall in thick, swirling flakes. The air was crisp, the temperature was dropping fast, but we weren't deterred. We piled our gear onto our backs and set off down the trail. The path was mostly clear, but with each step, the snow began to build up on the ground, coating everything in a thick layer of white. The forest around us was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional rustle of a tree branch swaying in the wind. There was no wildlife to be seen, no birds calling, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath. After a couple of hours of hiking, we arrived at our campsite. The snowstorm was picking up, and the wind was beginning to howl through the trees. We quickly set up the tent and a small fire pit, hoping to stay warm through the night. The snow was falling so heavily that it made the world outside the firelight look like a ghostly blur, and the wind sounded like a chorus of whispers from the trees. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Mark said, his voice low as he sat by the fire. Chris chuckled and threw another log on the fire. "Don't be ridiculous. It's just a snowstorm. We've dealt with worse." But Mark wasn't convinced. He kept looking around, his eyes darting to the tree line, as if waiting for something to appear out of the swirling snow. We ate quickly, more out of necessity than enjoyment, and then sat around the fire, watching the flames flicker in the wind. The storm had grown worse, and the snow was falling in sheets, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The temperature had dropped significantly, and even the warmth from the fire seemed inadequate against the biting cold. As the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. The fire crackled and the wind continued to howl, but the air around us seemed still. It was too quiet. The snowstorm was relentless, but there was no other sound. No animals, no wind in the trees. It felt like we were the only ones left in the world, and that thought sent a chill down my spine. Chris broke the silence. "You guys ever heard about the old ghost stories around here?" Mark rolled his eyes. "Here we go." "No, seriously," Chris said, his voice getting quieter. "There are rumors. People say this area is haunted, that hikers and campers have gone missing before, that there's something out there in the woods. Some people think it's a spirit, others think it's just some kind of creature." Mark laughed nervously. "You've been reading too many scary stories." But I couldn't help but feel the tension rising. It was as if the forest itself was listening to us, waiting. I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not in the traditional sense, but the weight of the atmosphere around us felt different. I stood up, feeling the need to stretch my legs. The wind was howling even louder now, and the snow was starting to cover our fire pit. I glanced back at the tent, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the camp was empty. Only the three of us sat around the fire. I wandered a little deeper into the trees, trying to shake off the creeping sense of paranoia. But the further I walked, the more I began to feel like I wasn't alone. There was a presence around me, something I couldn't quite explain. I heard a rustling sound to my right, and I spun around, my heart racing. But it was only the wind, I told myself. I turned to head back to the fire, but then I heard something else, a soft thudding sound, like footsteps in the snow. I stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced around, but the trees were silent, the snow still falling in a steady, relentless pattern. I took another step, then another. The footsteps came again, closer this time. My pulse quickened. I spun around expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. My mind raced. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. It was like the forest itself had come alive, and it was watching me. "Mark!" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Chris!" I turned back toward the camp and ran, my boots crunching through the snow. When I reached the fire, my friends were staring at me, their faces pale. "What's wrong?" Mark asked. "There's something out there," I said, trying to catch my breath. I heard footsteps, someone walking through the snow. "Stop messing around," Chris said. "We're all on edge from the storm. You're hearing things." But I knew what I'd heard. I was sure of it. "I'm telling you, I'm not crazy," I said, my voice shaking. There was something out there. The wind had picked up even more now, and the snow was coming down harder. We huddled closer to the fire, but the cold seemed to seep into our bones. As we sat in silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest around us was too quiet, too still. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw something, a shadow, moving in the trees. I blinked, convinced it was just my imagination, but then it moved again. It was tall, too tall to be a person, and it didn't seem to move like anything human. The figure stood at the edge of the tree line, watching us. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Chris and Mark turned toward the trees, but by the time they looked, the figure was gone. "You're losing it," Mark said, his voice tight with tension. But I knew what I'd seen. It was real. We quickly decided to pack up and leave. There was no way we were staying another night in that campsite. The storm had turned the world into a swirling mass of white, and the air felt suffocating. The figure in the trees was still burned into my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, something that had been watching us the entire time. We packed up our tent and gear as fast as we could, but the snow was falling so heavily that it was hard to see the trail. The wind whipped at our faces, stinging with cold. As we made our way back down the trail, the footsteps from earlier seemed to echo in the distance, growing fainter but never disappearing. The snowstorm felt like it was closing in around us. By the time we made it back to the car, we were exhausted, cold, and terrified. The storm had swallowed up the forest behind us, and we didn't look back. As we drove away, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back seat, but there was nothing. The drive back felt longer than it should have, and none of us said much. I don't know if my friends believed what I'd heard or seen, but I knew what I'd felt. The forest wasn't just empty snow. It was full of something else. Something that didn't want us there. When we got home, we never spoke of it again. It wasn't until months later that Mark admitted he'd heard the footsteps, too, though he didn't want to acknowledge it at the time. But I knew. I knew that whatever had been out there in the snowstorm, it wasn't just the wind. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm arrived early, just as the weather forecast had predicted. I'd been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. I'd always loved the outdoors, but there was something different about winter camping. The silence of the snow, the stillness in the air. It felt like you could escape everything, like the world was on pause. But this trip would be the last time I ever set foot in a snowstorm. I had chosen a secluded spot in the mountains, miles from the nearest trailhead. The route to my campsite had already been tough, with the snow accumulating quickly. I was alone, just me and the wilderness. I had a sturdy tent, plenty of food, and my gear was in order. The first few hours of the trip had been peaceful. The wind howled through the trees, but it didn't feel unusual. I was used to the solitude and the harshness of the environment. When I set up camp, the storm was still manageable. Snow fell softly around me as I pitched my tent. The cold wasn't unbearable, and I built a small fire in the fire ring nearby. The flickering flames seemed to offer the only warmth in a cold world. I huddled next to the fire, my breath visible in the freezing air, eating my dinner and watching the storm intensify. By the time night came, the wind had picked up. It howled through the trees, sending the snow swirling into blinding drifts. The fire had long since died, and I retreated into my tent to escape the harsh wind. But inside the tent, things felt different. The air was thick, suffocating. The storm outside seemed to be pressing against the fabric of my shelter. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of unease only grew. The silence in the tent was stifling. The wind, the howling gusts of snow, everything outside seemed muffled, as if the storm were cocooning me. I huddled inside my sleeping bag, trying to sleep, but every creak of the tent made me jump. The sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was with me in the dark, was unnerving. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I woke to a soft sound outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. The storm was still relentless, and the cold was seeping into the edges of the tent. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of footsteps in the snow. I froze. Who could be out there? The storm had been fierce, and no one else would be crazy enough to venture out in these conditions. I held my breath, listening closely. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, crunching through the thick snow, growing closer to my tent. My heart began to race, and I sat up, my mind spinning. I told myself it was nothing, that it was the wind, or maybe an animal, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The footsteps paused outside, and I could almost feel a presence near me, watching, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the thin fabric of the tent, but I saw nothing. The snow outside was thick, swirling in the wind, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. The footsteps had stopped. I waited, my mind racing. A long minute passed. I heard nothing but the storm and the pounding of my own heart in my ears. The tension in the air was suffocating, and the unease grew into a full-blown panic. I unzipped the tent flap just a fraction, poking my head out, shining the flashlight toward the campsite. The light caught only snowflakes swirling in the air, and in the distance, I could just barely make out the edge of the forest. But there was no one there, no one in sight, just the relentless storm. I exhaled slowly to calm my nerves, but something in the back of my mind told me that wasn't the end of it. I zipped the tent flap back up and lay down again, forcing myself to relax, though I could still feel the weight of someone's gaze. I don't know how long I lay awake, listening to the storm outside, but at some point I fell into a shallow sleep. Then it happened again, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible above the wind, but it came from outside the tent. I could hear the words, clear as day, "Help me." I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. My mind went into overdrive, my pulse quickening. Who was out there? I had been sure I was alone. The snow had already buried the trail, and no one could have reached this far out. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, trembling in the cold. The voice was softer now, but I could still hear it clearly. Please, help me. It was coming from somewhere near the edge of the clearing, just beyond my tent. I turned off the flashlight, trying to listen more closely. The words sounded desperate, but there was something wrong about them. It wasn't just the tone, but something about the voice. It felt unnatural, distorted, as if it wasn't quite real. I hesitated, unsure what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to ignore it, to wait until morning when the storm had passed. But the voice was too convincing, too real. I felt an overwhelming need to check, to make sure there wasn't someone out there, stranded in need of help. I opened the tent flap just enough to slip outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The snowstorm hit me immediately, the wind biting into my exposed skin, but I forced myself to move. My flashlight beam cut through the swirling snow, but I saw nothing, just the trees and the vast emptiness of the wilderness, and yet the voice was still there, faint but unmistakable. Help me, please. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one, just the endless whiteness of the storm. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, and for a split second I thought I saw something in the corner of my vision. A figure, tall and thin, standing among the trees, just at the edge of the forest. The figure was watching me, motionless. I froze. My blood ran cold. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was like it was part of the storm, a shadow lost in the whiteout. I turned and ran, stumbling back to the safety of the tent, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't dare look back. I dove inside and zipped the tent shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The voice faded as I closed the flap, and the storm seemed to settle, though the unease lingered. I lay in my sleeping bag, wide awake, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The storm had played tricks on my mind. It was a hallucination. But even as I told myself that, I couldn't shake the image of the figure, the one standing in the snow, watching me with hollow eyes. By morning, the storm had subsided, but the forest still seemed to press in around me, silent and cold. I packed up quickly, eager to leave, not wanting to linger any longer in that haunted clearing. As I hiked back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure following me, drifting through the snow. I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then I felt the weight of that night pressing on me, a memory I couldn't shake. I never went back to that spot in the mountains. The memory of the voice, the figure in the snow, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me. And every time a snowstorm blows in, I remember that night, the night I should have never gone camping in the first place. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was supposed to be a weekend to remember. One of those adventures that would become the stories we told for years to come. It was the kind of idea that seemed perfect in the middle of a busy work week. My best friend, Ryan, and I, with our backpacks, boots, and gear, ready to head into the Adirondacks for a winter camping trip. We didn't expect any major issues. Sure, there was a snowstorm predicted for the weekend, but that didn't scare us. We'd both hiked plenty of times before, and this was just another challenge. The drive up was peaceful. The snowflakes began falling in light flurries as we left the city, growing heavier as we reached the base of the mountains. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the snow was coming down thick and fast. We were prepared for it, or so we thought. Ryan joked that this would be a perfect test of our skills, though there was something in his tone, something uneasy, that I didn't fully catch at the time. We strapped our backpacks onto our shoulders and began our hike. The trail was well worn, but the snow was building quickly, making it more difficult with each step. The wind picked up, adding an eerie howl to the mix. As we trudged deeper into the woods, the world became quieter, more muffled, as though the storm was pressing in around us. The snow clung to the trees, creating an almost suffocating sense of isolation. By the time we found our spot to camp, the visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The storm had intensified and the wind was relentless, gusting through the trees and howling across the landscape. We struggled to set up the tent in the swirling snow, each of us fighting to keep it upright as the wind pushed against it. The effort was exhausting, but we eventually managed to secure everything. I couldn't help but notice how eerily it had become. No animals, no sounds at all, just the howling wind. It was as if nature itself had retreated, leaving us alone in this frozen wilderness. Once the tent was set up and our gear was inside, we huddled around the small campfire we managed to get going. It was a temporary comfort against the cold, the flames flickering and casting long shadows across the snow. I could see Ryan's face illuminated in the glow of the firelight, but his usual relaxed expression was gone. His eyes were wide, and there was something unsettling about his silence. "Something feels off," Ryan said after a long pause. I chuckled, trying to break the tension. "You're just spooked by the storm. It's not like we haven't camped in worse conditions before." But Ryan didn't laugh. He stared into the fire for a long moment before looking up at me. "No, it's not just the storm. It's the woods. It feels wrong." I rolled my eyes, trying to reassure him. "It's probably just the weather messing with your head." But as I spoke, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. The forest around us felt too still. There were no animal tracks in the snow, no sounds from the trees, nothing. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. We ate a quick dinner in silence, then crawled into our sleeping bags, both of us trying to get some sleep before the storm got worse. But sleep wouldn't come. The wind continued to howl outside, shaking the tent, but there was something else, a strange, distant sound that I couldn't identify. It sounded like footsteps, soft, slow footsteps in the snow, but I couldn't place where they were coming from. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became. It was the sound of someone walking outside the tent. I lay there, wide awake, listening, waiting for another sound. Then I heard it again, another soft step in the snow, this time closer. I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. My heart began to race. I slowly turned to Ryan, but he was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. We both lay in silence, listening to the soft crunch of snow outside. It felt like hours passed, though it was probably only minutes. The storm raged on, the wind picking up again, but those footsteps, those slow, deliberate steps, were unmistakable. I could feel my body tensing, my mind racing through all the possible explanations. It could have been an animal, I told myself, maybe a deer or a bear, But somehow I knew that wasn't it. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded human. We waited for what felt like an eternity, each of us holding our breath, straining to hear. Then suddenly we heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper. It was soft, almost like a hum, but the words, if they were words, were impossible to make out. Ryan's face went ashen. That wasn't the wind, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to argue, to tell him it was nothing, but the truth was I was just as terrified. The air outside seemed to thicken with something dark, something unnatural. I thought about getting up to investigate, but something inside me told me to stay still, to stay quiet. The footsteps returned, this time much closer, right outside the tent. I could feel the weight of them as if someone was standing just beyond the fabric, watching us. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly reached for the knife I kept in my pack, my fingers trembling. Then, without warning, the flap of the tent was yanked open and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. But when I looked, there was nothing there. Nothing except the storm, the snow, and the endless blackness beyond the light of our fire. We scrambled to our feet, fumbling with the zippers, our eyes scanning the snow. There was no one. But the tracks were there. Fresh tracks in the snow, right outside the tent, footprints leading off into the woods as though someone had walked right up to our tent and then vanished. The prints weren't those of an animal, nor were they the typical easy-to-read impressions of someone wearing boots. These were odd. The tracks were uneven, as if the person who made them was dragging their feet, stumbling with every step. Who the hell is out there? Ryan's voice trembled with fear, his eyes darting around in a panic. I had no answer. I couldn't even form a coherent thought. The storm raged louder than ever, the wind screaming through the trees, and yet it felt like the forest was alive in a way that was impossible to ignore. We didn't sleep at all that night. We stayed awake, listening to every sound, every creak of the trees, every gust of wind. At first light, we packed up the tent in a hurry, both of us too scared to stay another minute. The storm hadn't let up and the snow was still coming down hard, but we needed to leave. We had to get out. As we retraced our steps back to the trailhead, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following us. But there was nothing. The snow had erased the tracks, and the forest looked as empty as it had when we first arrived. Still, the feeling didn't go away, that cold sense of being watched. We didn't talk much on the hike back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. By the time we reached the truck, we were exhausted, terrified, and ready to leave it all behind. We never spoke of that trip again. Neither of us could explain what had happened that night. The footsteps, the whispering voice, the feeling of being hunted by something that wasn't human, it all felt too real. Whatever was in those woods, whatever was following us, I don't think it wanted us there. And I don't think it's forgotten us either. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
We'd been planning the trip for months, eager to get out of the city and into the mountains. It was December, just before Christmas, and the forecast called for a light snowstorm over the weekend. Perfect for a winter camping adventure, we thought. I was with my two best friends, Sam and Mike, and the idea was escape everything, enjoy some quiet, and maybe challenge ourselves a little. We chose a remote spot in the Rocky Mountains, about a 5-hour drive from home, where we could hike to a secluded area. None of us were strangers to camping, but winter camping was a different beast entirely. Still, the three of us had camped in the summer before, so we figured we were prepared for a little cold and snow. We packed all the essentials: tents, sleeping bags, food, and water, plus layers of warm clothes and a few backup supplies, just in case. The drive was long, but we finally reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. The snow had started to fall lightly by then, but it wasn't too bad. We pulled on our gear and began hiking toward the campsite we'd picked out, a spot near a small lake. The trail was a little more rugged than we anticipated, but it was beautiful. The snow was clinging to the trees, the whole forest turning into a winter wonderland. By the time we reached our site, the snow was coming down harder. The temperature had dropped significantly, and we hurried to get our tents set up before nightfall. It was dark by the time we finished, and the firewood we gathered seemed to burn too quickly in the cold air. But we managed to get a fire going, and soon we were huddled around it, making dinner and sharing stories to pass the time. The storm raged on outside. The wind was picking up, causing the firelight to dance and flicker. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, and the sound of the wind howling through the trees started to make everything feel a little off. It wasn't the usual quiet of the forest. The wind made it feel like the trees were alive, creaking and groaning, moving with a life of their own. Sam, Mike, and I were talking, but I found it hard to concentrate. I kept feeling like there was something else out there, something watching us. I told myself it was just the storm messing with my head. After all, the forest could feel eerie at night, and I was probably just imagining things. But then, as we were about to settle down for the night, something strange happened. I stepped out of the tent to relieve myself, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. The wind had stopped, and the world seemed eerily still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The snow had stopped falling, and everything around me was covered in a blanket of white, untouched. It felt wrong. Then I heard it. A faint noise, like footsteps in the snow. It was far away at first, but I stopped, listening carefully. The sound was slow, deliberate, heavy steps crunching in the snow. At first, I thought it was Mike or Sam, but then I remembered they were still in the tent. I turned around to look back at camp, but the figures inside the tent were still. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the woods, deeper into the trees. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the better of me. I took a few steps toward the source of the noise. The steps continued, but now they were closer. The cold, bitter air seemed to press against my skin. I called out to Sam and Mike, but they didn't answer. The footsteps stopped suddenly. I froze in place, my breath clouding in the air, trying to listen. There was nothing, no wind, no other sound, just that eerie silence again. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. I turned and hurried back to the tent, zipping it up quickly behind me. Sam and Mike were still inside, laughing and talking, oblivious to what had just happened. I didn't want to scare them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Hear what?" Mike asked, not looking up from his book. "Footsteps. Outside." Sam looked at me, his brow furrowed. "Footsteps? In this snowstorm? You're hearing things, man." Maybe I was, but deep down I wasn't so sure. I lay awake for hours, listening to the storm outside, hoping to hear the familiar sounds of the forest, the wind, the crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. But instead, I heard nothing. The silence was oppressive, unnerving. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep much that night. When I finally drifted off, it was only for a short while, and when I woke up, it was to the sound of my friends stirring. The storm had calmed, and the moon was visible through the gaps in the clouds. It was quiet outside, but that didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it only made the situation more unsettling. We spent the morning packing up, our enthusiasm for the trip fading with the storm. The air was colder than before, and everything was covered in thick layers of snow. But as we packed our gear, something caught my eye. Tracks, footprints leading directly to our campsite. They were deep in the snow, wide like a person's, but there was something odd about them. They weren't exactly human-looking, more like they were dragging along the snow. Long, uneven steps, almost like someone had been crawling through the snow. "Where did these come from?" I asked, my voice tight. Sam's face went pale when he saw them. They weren't there last night. We would have seen them." Mike seemed less concerned, but I could tell he was starting to get uneasy. Maybe it's just some animal, but I knew it wasn't. The prints didn't make sense for an animal. They were too large, too deliberate. It was like someone or something had been walking around our camp while we were asleep. We didn't stay much longer. None of us wanted to stick around to investigate further. We packed up quickly, got our things together, and left the camp behind. As we hiked back down the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like we were being followed. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees and the snow. It wasn't until we were almost back to the trailhead that I noticed something else. Just off to the side, between the trees, I saw something. Someone, maybe, standing there. A figure, tall and unnaturally still, watching us. I stopped walking, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Sam and Mike both turned to look, But by the time they did, the figure was gone. Just gone. Like it had never been there at all. We didn't talk much after that. We just kept walking, faster now, and when we reached the truck, I felt a weight lift from my chest. We drove back to the city in silence, none of us saying what we were all thinking. But I'll never forget that night. The footsteps, the dragging prints, the figure standing in the trees. It felt like we weren't alone. And to this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the snowstorm following us. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just me, the mountains, and the snow. I had planned the camping trip meticulously, a solo retreat to clear my head to escape the grind of everyday life. The forecast had predicted light snow and mild winds, nothing that should have posed a problem for an experienced camper like myself. But of course, nature had other plans. I'd arrived in the mountains early in the afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky a pale gray, and the world seemed untouched by anything man-made. I found a small, secluded spot near a stream where the trees were dense enough to shield me from the worst of the wind. It was beautiful, a picture-perfect winter wonderland. I quickly set up camp, taking my time to make sure everything was perfect. I erected my tent, unpacked my sleeping bag and supplies, and started a fire in a small fire pit I had dug earlier. I enjoyed the ritual of it all, the sense of being prepared and self-sufficient. There was something almost sacred about being in nature like this, just you and the elements. By nightfall, the storm had started. The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I stoked the fire, but the wind seemed determined to put it out. I retreated into my tent, zipping it closed against the cold. It was warm inside my sleeping bag, but the storm outside rattled the fabric of the tent, making it feel like the whole world was coming apart. I tried to settle in, but sleep didn't come easy. The wind was louder than I had expected, and it crept into my thoughts. Every gust made the tent shudder, and every creak of the branches outside made my heart race. I told myself it was just the weather. It was normal to feel uneasy when you're out in the wild alone, especially in a snowstorm. I tried to calm myself and closed my eyes, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the wind. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm, but it was there. A soft, slow thudding sound, like footsteps in the snow. I froze. The footsteps weren't consistent, as though the person was stumbling or unsure of where they were walking, but there was no way anyone could be out there. I was miles from the nearest trail, and the weather was miserable. No sane person would be out here in this. I strained my ears, trying to hear better. The footsteps were closer now, the crunch of snow unmistakable. They were coming around the tent. I felt my pulse quicken. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I stay silent? The thought of confronting whoever or whatever was out there made my stomach churn. But I had to know. I couldn't just sit in my tent, terrified. I slowly unzipped the flap, just enough to peek outside. My flashlight cut through the swirling snow, but I saw nothing. Just the dim outline of the trees, their branches heavy with snow. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my breath shallow, the only sound the howling wind. For a long moment, nothing moved. The storm raged on, the snow piling up outside. I took a deep breath and zipped the tent back up, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The wind had made me paranoid. But then, just as I was about to settle back into my sleeping bag, I heard it again. A voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but it was there. Help me. It was unmistakable. I froze again. My heart slammed in my chest. The voice had come from right outside the tent, just beyond the thin fabric. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A human voice, or at least it sounded like one. Help me, the voice repeated, more urgently this time. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I wanted to call out off to ask if someone needed help, but the fear that gripped me kept me rooted to the spot. What if it was a trap? What if I went out there and found nothing, or worse, something waiting for me? The voice didn't stop. It was softer now, but still there, still pleading. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no one else out here, I was sure of it. And yet the voice persisted, coming from the snowstorm, from the void outside my tent. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the strength to move. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, the cold steel a small comfort in my shaking hands. I unzipped the tent flap carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. I poked my head out, my flashlight scanning the area. Nothing. The snow fell in thick, chaotic sheets, and the world around me was nothing but white. The figure I expected to see, someone, anyone, wasn't there. No footprints, no movement, nothing. The voice had stopped, too. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had played tricks on me, but I knew I hadn't. The voice had been too real, too desperate. I stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The air was bitterly cold, and the wind whipped the snow into my face, but there was no one in sight. Nothing. Just the trees, the snow, and the storm. I felt a surge of relief wash over me. It had been nothing. I was being ridiculous. I turned to go back to the tent when I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, I saw something. Someone. It was standing still, barely visible through the blinding snow. A figure. Tall, thin, almost skeletal. And it was watching me. My stomach dropped. I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place as I stared at the figure. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. But I felt its gaze, cold and unblinking. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to run, to scramble back into the tent and zip it shut, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I stood there, rooted to the spot as the figure remained motionless. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The snow and wind obscured it, and when I looked again, it was no longer there. I turned and bolted back into the tent, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a wild animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stayed awake, the sound of my own breathing the only thing keeping me grounded. Every gust of wind, every creak of the tent made me jump. The voice, the figure, they haunted me in the dark. At first light, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, the storm still swirling around me. I didn't dare look back as I made my way down the trail, my mind racing. I don't know what I encountered that night, whether it was something real or a product of my fear in the storm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me. I never went back to that spot, and I never camped in the mountains alone again.